Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Globe and Mail's Resilient Grids event. I'm Matthew McLaren, data journalist for the Globe and Mail, and I'm pleased to be your host and moderator today. It's great to have many of you here in person, and as well as a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us virtually. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which the Globe and Mail headquarters is situated is within the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Métis Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation. We are grateful for the opportunity to work and live on this unceded land and to learn and listen from Indigenous community leaders as we work together for a sustainable future. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I'd like to recognize Eaton for making today's event possible. We are pleased to have a speaker from Eaton on the program today, along with other experts who are joining us independently. Over the next hour, we're going to be talking about the reliability of Canada's electricity grid. It's an urgent topic. We've suffered plenty of extreme weather events over the past few years that have reminded us that we have aging infrastructure and issues also arising from a digital transformation. There's lots of challenges to discuss here. We'll start with an interview followed by a panel discussion. We'll take some of your questions in the later half, I hope, and also from the virtual audience. Please type your questions in the Q&A box on your screen if you want to send us a question. So let's get started. My first guest today is Francis Bradley, right here to my left, President and CEO of Electricity Canada. It's a national industry organization representing the electricity sector. And its members include utilities and power producers and transmission and along with other suppliers within the industry. So thanks for being here today with us, Francis.
Okay, delighted to be part of the conversation.
So I guess one of the first things I want to start out with is wildfires, which is very top of mind for everyone. We've had wildfires across the country. What are extreme events like this telling us and revealing about the resilience of the electricity grids we have here today in Canada?
So you may find this a little bit surprising, but I think what they've been showing us is that we actually have fairly resilient grids, all told. When you look at the massive destruction caused by things like the wildfires or the derecho in Ottawa last year, hurricanes, the increasing frequency and the increasing severity of extreme weather has caused incredible damage to our networks, but we've been able to recover, and we've been able to recover, frankly, in record time. When you look at the large numbers of customers that were out, for example, as a result of Fiona, and how quickly they were brought back. I know when you're sitting in the dark, it feels like a long time. But when you think of all of the effort that's required to bring those customers back and the fact that they're brought back into service so quickly, I think it shows a level of resilience that frankly is increasing and is improving.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
while it's getting more difficult.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Well, we do see that some of these events, you can have service out in some places for as much as 2 weeks, but usually like the bulk of customers are brought back on very quickly,
Yep.
right? And I think that's what we're talking about
Absolutely.
here. That most people get brought on.
Yep.
Is that something that we can expect to continue in a world where demand is increasing or is expected to increase dramatically,
Yep.
and we're expected to have more extreme events?
Well, and that adds to the challenge, right? Demand will likely increase exponentially, frankly. The Government of Canada has an objective for the electricity grid to be non-emitting by 2035 and the entire Canadian economy to be carbon neutral by 2050. That's going to result in a need to double or triple the amount of electricity that we produce today. And so weather is becoming more extreme. The frequency of these weather events is increasing. And at the same time, we're going to be growing the electricity grid. And we're going to be becoming increasingly more dependent upon electricity. Right now, electricity meets roughly 20% of our end-use energy demand. It's probably going to rise to somewhere around 70%. And so the criticality will be that much more important. So the importance of this is not going away. It's only going to increase.
Mm-hmm. So you say that we have a reliable grid, but where are the vulnerabilities? What keeps you up at night when you look at the grid we have today and look where we're heading?
Supply chain and people. Those are the two big issues that I see right now. We already, and a lot has been written about supply chain challenges broadly right across the economy, but they're particularly acute, frankly, for the electricity system. Everything from transformers to rebar to bucket trucks, the delays in terms of getting equipment is significant today. Now, if we're going to be doubling or tripling the system, there will be that much more pressure on our supply chains. So I'm particularly concerned about the supply chains, and I'm concerned about having enough people, being able to attract the talent. We've got a talent squeeze on right now. We are challenged to be able to find sufficient people to be able to work in the sector today. What happens when the sector needs to grow 2 to 3 times? So that's what's keeping me up at night, is the supply of people and the supply of equipment.
Mm-hmm. All good points. But I wonder, we have a grid that we've inherited from, a century more of development. Yep. And I wonder, of course, a lot of it's an above ground network. It made sense at the time, both economically and others. But are there any aspects of that system that are not going to serve us well in the future? How much do you think needs to be rethought from the way that we traditionally built out our networks?
Yeah, well, and we're seeing an evolution right now, right? Every time new sort of sections and new parts of the grid are being built, decisions are being made today based upon a different calculation than the decisions that were made, a generation ago or a century ago. So for instance, now when looking at some of the projects of transmission between Canada and the United States in New England, some sections of those are going underwater and some sections are going underground. But it always comes down to trying to balance the reliability and the cost to the customer, because in the end, when you're talking about putting significant parts of the system underground, there are very significant impacts in terms of what the cost of that is going to be, and in the end, somebody has to pay for those costs.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good segue, because we're talking about building out massive infrastructure in the coming decades, and whenever I think about that, I often wonder, can we really afford it, and who's going to pay for it? I know that's a complicated question, but give me the Coles Notes.
All right, so the first part of the answer is, can we not afford it? When we look at the impact of extreme weather today, and we haven't hit that 1.5 degrees, which we're probably going to be exceeding, not acting on addressing climate change, and there's been some studies produced on this, is going to be significantly more expensive overall than not taking action on climate change. Now, who's going to pay for it? And that's a really interesting question, because, for example, if you look at we're operating right now in terms of planning out an electricity system based upon commitments that the Government of Canada has made to reduce our GHG emissions. Well, that's a national objective. That's a public good. Should all of that be borne by electricity ratepayers? And our view is we need to look at balancing that between public funding, taxpayer-funded investments, and electricity ratepayers. And we think it's likely some kind of a balance, because, as I say, this is a public good. We're not pursuing this simply because we want to deliver more kilowatts. We're doing this because we want to address climate change.
Mm-hmm. And do you think the political will is there, and do you think ratepayers were willing to pay more?
That's the challenge, right? Well, I think the political will, we're starting to see that the political will is there. The federal budget this past March, the first time that we saw very significant and systemic funding from the Government of Canada into electricity infrastructure. It's something that we've been talking about and seeking for quite some time, probably spurred by the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. But nonetheless, we've now seen at least an openness by the Government of Canada to make investments in this space. Over the years, we've seen investments provincially into infrastructure. So I think the openness is there. And in terms of the customer, yeah, I mean, there is a significant concern about affordability and ability for the customer to be able to pay, which is why we talk about, let's look at balancing both tax-based funding and ratepayer funding.
Mm-hmm. Okay. One last thing I wanted to ask you is, the grid has been described as one of the biggest machines that mankind has ever made. So It's enormously complex. But for our audience, what are utilities doing right now to make a more resilient grid? What are a few of the examples that are happening right now, how the grid is changing from its traditional state and how it's here in Canada?
Yeah, well, let me give you kind of quickly two pieces on this. The first piece is, when we're talking about extreme weather and weather events and responding to weather events, there's always been kind of a process of continuous improvement. Every time there's a big event that happens, the players in the sector get together and figure out how should we change for the next event. So, for example, the big ice storm in 1998, that changed how we designed transmission towers, right?
Support the loads from ice,
absolutely.
Right?
Now we suddenly said, wait a second, we're actually going to get more ice, and so in the future we need to build for more ice. Every time there is a major wildfire that impacts electricity infrastructure, we then take a look at do we need to adjust how wide right-of-ways need to be. So there's that side of it. And the other side of it is how the sector has been coming together to address cyber threats. And cyber threats are increasing. Certainly, the threat actors are becoming far more sophisticated. On the one hand, and we saw some reports both from Canadian officials and U.S. officials about that in the recent past. And at the same time, that broader electrification overall is going to increase the potential attack surface. And so. That sounds scary, but the good news is, I think, I've seen a level of collaboration and cooperation within the industry to try and meet that cyber threat head on. That I'm relieved we're doing that. Otherwise, we would, I think, be in very dire circumstances from a cyber threat standpoint.
Well, so we've been talking about extreme events up to this point, but you raise a very important point about cybersecurity. Well, what is the threat landscape today? What do you see as the major things that utilities in this country, transmission utilities, should be worried about?
Well, I mean, there are, and again, this is based upon reporting from both American officials and Canadian officials. There are state actors and foreign state affiliated actors that have an interest and have been targeting critical infrastructure generally and electricity infrastructure specifically. So, we do know that they are targeting our infrastructure overall, and frankly, that threat environment has become more concerning since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's actually made the cyber threat environment even more volatile.
What's happening? What are utilities dealing with on a regular basis?
Well, it's the same as governments, the same as other critical infrastructures in terms of constant attempts to essentially access critical systems. And it's a constant, it's an ongoing thing. When you talk to officials in government, you'll hear them talk about the millions of scans a day, and so we're facing that in the sector as well. This constant scanning all of the time, looking for vulnerabilities, seeking to find soft spots. And we've seen over the last several years there was an event in the United States that was reported on last year where a system was compromised and it did cause impacts. It wasn't in the electricity side of the business, but it is something that is absolutely a top concern for the sector.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Francis. I'm going to bring in the rest of the panel now, but I want you to stick around, and so.
Now that I've depressed everybody.
Not at all.
Next, I would like to introduce the panel. So first of all, we have Giselle de Grandis. She is Manager of Business Development and Market Strategy with Hydro One. Next, we have Daniela Carcassol, Assurance Energy Leader and for Canadian Power and Utilities with EY Canada. We have Chris Henderson, President of Lumos Energy and Founding Executive Director with Indigenous Clean Energy. And last but not least, we have Umesh Patel. He's Director of Marketing with Eaton Canada. So let's get started. I think we're going to have a far-ranging conversation here, but Giselle, let's start with you. You work for Hydro One, which is it basically manages Ontario's transmission, almost all of it, I believe. And we've experienced derechos and ice storms and other events taking out service from many Canadians. So how reliable are energy grids currently, where do you see the main vulnerabilities being when you have events like the derecho, for example?
Thanks for that question, Matthew. And I get to think to Francis's earlier point, our transmission system is extremely reliable in Ontario. We meet stringent regulatory standards. And as we like to say internally at Hydro One, there's no energy transition without transmission. We're really planning for it to be the backbone of electrification in the future. That said, at the distribution level, we cover a vast service territory of mostly rural Ontario. We have enough wires to wrap the world 3 times over, I understand. So the hardening exercise is very challenging. It's not cost effective to take certain hardening measures in many parts of the province. And so we are being creative about other ways of meeting customers' reliability needs. And maybe I could say a little bit more about that.
Well, I'm very interested in that. Yeah, please do.
Sure. So some of our customers with the lowest reliability on the longest, most unreliable feeders experience significant outage hours each year, but we have managed to introduce a really innovative solution by installing Tesla Powerwalls in their homes that provides backup power in the event of an outage. And doing this has brought down the number of outage hours that these customers experience significantly, and it's proven to be much cheaper than us building out the grid to meet their needs. So we're looking at what we can do with distributed energy resources like behind-the-meter batteries to meet our customers' reliability needs better.
How much storage do you get out of one of these walls? Like, if you have an outage, how much time does that buy you to restore service, for example?
I think that varies based on the consumption at the home, but my understanding is about 24 hours between the two. So we're placing 2 Powerwall 2s with each customer, and they can get about 24 hours of backup power out of it, depending on their consumption.
And you mentioned that term, distributed energy resource, DER, which I think we're going to be talking about more here now. Just explain to us what those are. You gave a great example of these Tesla Powerwalls, but just lay that out for the audience.
Sure. A distributed energy resource, or DER, is a small-scale either generator, storage, or load controller embedded in the distribution system. And these are really cool devices that our customers are buying unprompted on their own for a variety of reasons as part of the energy transition. They're looking for that resilience. They want to contribute to a greener grid, and they also want to be able to save money, and these devices let them do all 3 of those things. So rooftop solar is an example, batteries, EVs, smart thermostats, this sort of thing. We're seeing those proliferate with our customers, and we're figuring out how to leverage them and unlock new value streams for these customers as well by letting their utility, Hydro One, draw on the demand or supply flexibility that these devices offer us, with their consent and with compensation.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a lot of different examples, and there's a lot of reasons why you might be interested in these things. But if you're a customer who's primarily concerned with resilience, what's the sweet spot there? Which are the most important ones that actually add to the resilience of the grid?
So I don't want to plug really expensive devices that not every home can afford right now. But generation and storage closer to the home or in the home can go a long way with local resilience. But even kind of with a lower cost of entry, these smart devices like smart thermostats or smart water heaters, they allow the grid to maintain reliability at times of peak demand, and that has community-wide benefit. So it will benefit that home that has installed this device as well as entire neighborhoods. And so we're seeing those really take off. We think that our residential customers have about 200,000 smart thermostats already, and we've introduced a new demand response program to start enrolling these thermostats. And we are paying customers $75 to voluntarily opt into this program. And the idea is that it would allow us to reduce consumption slightly at times of grid strain, for example, on a very hot afternoon when people are blasting their air conditioners. But this can be enough to keep the entire system reliable, and will compensate the customer for providing that service and reward them for bringing that device to us.
And what's been the uptake so far?
Well, we just went out with this program, and we have enrolled about 5,300 people so far. We're going to be enrolling other device types, including behind-the-meter battery systems, EV chargers, smart water heaters, all the stuff in the coming months. But we're starting right now with smart thermostats controlling AC systems, and yeah, we're hoping to get to 10,000 in the next few weeks.
Well, thank you very much. So that's Ontario. Daniela, let's zoom out a little more and look at the issue nationally. So I know that your organization studies utilities and investments across the country. So what are utilities doing across Canada to increase resilience of their grids?
I mean, I think there's a lot of what's happening. Each province has got its own challenges, and so what you're going to see that works well for Ontario may be a little bit different for Alberta. The utilities are starting to evolve, and they're starting to look at electrification and battery storage and all the other DERs. And so I think that's similar across the country, but what I think needs to happen and what needs to evolve is that all the provinces need to collaborate and work together in order for this to work better.
Oh boy, is that going to happen?
I think it needs to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It has
I
to
don't think we have
happen.
a choice. Yeah.
If you said yes, I was going to have to get up and just start banging out a story on that. 'Cause I don't think I've ever heard of the provinces being that great at I mean, yeah, there are examples of cooperation, but perhaps nowhere near to the extent that you're describing. I mean,
Exactly.
yeah. How are we going to get there?
Well, I think it is going to take some investment, and there is going to be, I believe there'll be a requirement to pilot and pilot new ways and new digital ways to do things. So I think that might be a good area for us to get there, because it'll have to start small in order to get to that massive change that we need.
Looking across the country, are there any utilities that are particularly forward-thinking, in your view, on grid resilience, who are doing really interesting, cutting-edge things and not just doing things the way that they've always been done? I'm looking for things like beyond vegetation management and all the.
Yeah, I don't know if I would ever. I don't know if I have the ability to say which utility that would be, but I think the utilities are doing a great job trying to be as innovative as they possibly can. Of course, the Tesla Powerwalls is a great example of that. My friend here at Hydro One is doing a great job. So I don't know if I'd call out a specific utility, but I do see that a lot of them are evolving in that direction.
Mm-hmm. What about technologies that might, that we haven't traditionally used, that offers new tools to enhance grid resilience? Which ones excite you most? Which ones do you find?
The digital grids, you mean?
Yeah.
And the twinning. I think those ones are worth the investment right now. I'm getting some nods here.
Mm-hmm. Chris, why? Why?
Because it's giving you redundancy. It's giving you abilities to deal with circumstances that change, and it gives you ability to deal with extreme events. And we're taking advantage of the digital technologies that are evolving. I mean, digitalization is the heart of being able to deal with electrification and dealing with a net zero future. And those tools are becoming more powerful. AI is powerful in that. It gives us cyber security protection. So we have to move down those paths. And there are a lot of utilities doing very, very good work, not just Europe, but also in the United States and Europe. And you would recognize there's a lot of connection between the utilities in Canada and the US utilities, right. Very close connections. So the dialogues that are happening there, and we're using the new tools from companies like Eaton, who makes these things, is very, very valuable. So I do agree, digitalization is really one of the key ways that we're going to be able to deal with resilience.
You mentioned cross-border cooperation. It's my understanding, my layman's understanding, that one of the reasons why we have the reliability level that we have today is partly because of, over the past few decades, there's been increased connections between grids. Long and short of it is we used to have provincial monopolies, I understand, and so you have these like individual fiefdoms that had very little capacity to trade electricity between them. And that's, now US states, Canadian provinces have enhanced ability to cooperate on that. How much of that, am I right? Is that a big part of the story about how we achieve the reliability we have today? Francis, what do you think?
Absolutely. We've got 3 dozen interconnections across the border. To Giselle's point earlier about, there's not going to be a transition without transmission. Transmission and larger grids are more reliable, quite simply. If you have a small isolated grid, and look at remote communities in the north, you have to build 100% redundancy. If you've got a small generating station for a small community, you need to build a second one, because if that one breaks, you need a backup. If you interconnect, it increases your resilience. And so your redundancy, in fact, comes from your interconnection. So the broader the grids, the greater reliability. And so we've seen a significant increase in reliability as we've seen those greater interconnections. The question is, where do we go as we build out the system for the future? And so a lot of the conversation for the last year or two has been about generation and how we're going to have to double or triple generation. But the transmission, distribution, and on the customer end, all of those are going to be critical as well. Larger grids are more reliable.
Investment. We're going to need investment for that,
Yep.
to do that. I think that's going to be key as well.
Yeah, I think, and that's a key thing that we're going to have to discuss. We're going to circle back to that. But I just wanted, on the technology question, Umesh, I wanted to just circle back to you and find out what you think some of the most important technologies are going to be that we're not using today or not using enough today.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, we've covered a lot of the technologies.
Yep.
So everything that falls under the umbrella of distributed energy resources, or DERs, is going to be something that's going to make our grid more reliable, more resilient, and provide the additional capacity that we're going to need for the future. So I think that is probably one of the most promising technologies, and it's not a single technology, it's a group of technologies. The power really comes when you start orchestrating all of those as they're implemented, and there's bidirectional flow. So Giselle mentioned, for example, vehicle to grid. So when you start taking advantage of those types of opportunities, you're making your grid much more adaptable and much more responsive. So I think that is the big opportunity in terms of technology. Chris mentioned digitization or digitalization, just implementing more capabilities in terms of diagnostics and sensing within the grid or across the grid will provide more information that you can make decisions with. The risk, of course, is, you mentioned it, Francis, around cybersecurity. And so, when you build this out, you have to take all of that into consideration and balance it out, because now you've got a lot of data coming through and a lot of vulnerability, I guess, if you don't do it right. But, the two technologies, everything that falls under distributed energy resources and digitalization are the two that are most promising and the areas that we should be investing in.
Okay, and there's that word again, investment. So Danielle, where's the investment going to come from to pay for all of this? And are we able to access enough of it here in Canada to get to where we have to go?
No, that's a great question. We have EY came out with a publication called the Renewable Energy Country Attractiveness Index, and what it did was it indexed, ranked all the countries across the globe based on things like access to investments, long-term contracts, grid resiliency, and incidentally, Canada was ranked 12, up 3 spots from last year on it. And what it showed was, there is an increase in competition when it comes to energy transition, but as well, that brought a lot of increase in investment. And in fact, there was an increase of 19% in investment in 2022, which was a record high. But the question is that investment enough? And what we saw with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, and of course the budget 2023 in Canada, the one thing I would say is that's a step in the right direction, but I don't think that that's enough to fill the capital void that we need to get this done. And again, when it comes to collaboration, we need consumers, the industry, and investors to come together to make this happen. I don't think there's one silver bullet that's going to get us to 2050. I think all these organizations need to come together. And when it comes to the investment, we do need investment not only in the CapEx we've got today, but also an investment in where the demand is going in the future. And so that's going to be important. We need to start at 2050 and go backwards and see what gap we have and fill from there. I don't know if our budget got us there just yet.
I wonder if I could follow that money a little bit. I do agree with Danielle that we're going to have different forms of investment coming in, and we do have a big major gap. But I think we're looking at the grid and its reliance in terms of investment the wrong way. We're talking about infrastructure that's going to last 20, 40 to 60 years. When you look at investment that way, and we look at how we pay for energy, or what the consumer does, or industry does, we're looking at horizons that are about 5 to 10 years in the way it's being planned currently. And so therefore we make decisions, or policymakers make decisions, and regulators make decisions based on a 5 to 10 year horizon. We're talking 20, 30, 40, 60 years. So therefore I think what we have to see first of all is the best kind of energy is no energy. So I actually like energy rates to rise, but bills to remain the same. And the way you do that is giving more incentive on the part of consumers and industry to reduce the energy demand, which is the best form of an efficient system, the most economic form of the system. Yeah. Secondly, what you want to do is, I totally agree with Francis that there is a need for the public resource to come into play here. I do think the investment tax credit in the federal government, the last budget, and its extension to provincial utilities, state and crown, is a really big advantage. People should realize that has an infusion of capital that is significant, that in fact lasts generations, not 1 or 2 decades. And finally, yeah, the customer is going to have to pay more, but hey, you're paying more for food, you're paying more for your internet connections, you're paying more for your phones. That happens. To assume that we're going to meet the electricity demands that we want with a net zero future that is climate resilient by paying the same amount of money, well, that's irrational. And so I have no qualms about saying that to achieve the future that we want, we'll all pay more, but it's going to give us something else that we really need.
I really wanted to follow up on some of the stuff you mentioned about energy efficiency, but first, I want to point out that governments in this country have fallen sometimes, partly because rates went up on their watch and their political opponents said, these guys mismanaged an energy transition. We saw this, arguably, not everyone would agree, but I think arguably you could say that happened to the Wynne government here in Ontario, right? That rates went up, and it was part of the reason why it was a political liability for them. And they certainly felt that way based on some of the things that they did. And so I wonder whether Canadians are really willing to see their rates go significantly up, even if you say it's irrational to think that we can build an entirely new system and then it's not going to show up on bills. I would agree with you that it's irrational, but is it a risk that this whole thing could be derailed because and let's keep in mind that some bills it's a serious issue for a lot of people. They're already paying, a lot of households are already strained. 20-30% increase in bills can have a real impact. So let me open up the group here.
Yeah.
Danielle, you want to say something here?
No, I was going to say our demographics are key here. If you look at our demographics today, where you've got a big part of it is boomers and Gen X, they are more likely to pay based on value for money. And they want accessibility and affordability. What we should look at as well, though, is 10 years from now, the cohort will look a little bit different. It'll be, the majority will be millennials and Gen Y. And they are more likely to spend based on purpose and sustainability. And so their vote and their wallet will go to energy transition type matters. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration for future spending and where we're going with the rates. It's interesting because that index I was talking about, we understood that 61% of Canadians are really looking towards making decisions based on the environment and on the energy transition, but 64% of Canadians are also saying, I want value for money. So it is going to be, it's an odd difference, and I think that's going to change with the shift in the cohort of our population.
And it also depends how you participate. I totally agree with Danielle in terms of the generational issue. But Giselle has also talked about the fact that if individuals participate in that energy future, that we democratize energy more, so they can make choices and say, yes, I can generate some of my own energy, to what Amesh talked about, yes, I can get energy from my electric car that I charge on off-peak time with better rate differential that we should have in terms of off-peak time. Then they're saying, well, then I have choices where I can go. So we're not only a taker on price.
Right.
We are also, I mean, the concept of pro-consumers is where people are taking advantage to this. And digitalization allows you to do that. Demographics allows you to do that. And that democratizes energy. And that's the future we're striving for. I totally agree with you, Matt, that governments don't think that way. But you're asking for rationality in politics. I can't help you on that one. However, that's not our role. Our role is to bring rationality to where we need to go and communicate that to Canadians. And as more and more I'm seeing Canadians very much in the line and the theme of what Danielle talked about, to say, I think I want to do this with purpose. And if that purpose also allows me to be a generator of prosumer, maybe I want to go there.
And I'd add one more thing just to this, higher energy rates or electricity rates, right? I think we have to look at the total energy bill, right? And so maybe you're paying more for electricity, but you'll be paying less for, you'll use less gasoline, and you pay less for gasoline. You'll use less gas to heat up your home, and therefore you'll use, you'll pay less for that too. So I think, you have to look at it as your a consumer's or a business's total energy bill.
Next week, I'm picking up my EV. Finally, it's being delivered, and I'm very much looking forward to putting $8 of electricity into it instead of $95 of gas that I'm currently putting in my Forester.
And someone mentioned vehicle to grid earlier. So I wanted to just explore that a bit more, because a lot of people are interested in electric vehicles. Sales every year skyrocket. It's still a relatively small portion of the market, but growing extraordinarily quickly. And so in terms of the resilience of our grid, are these going to be a net benefit, or are they going to be a nightmare for utilities to deal with? Maybe I should ask you, Giselle, at Hydro One. How are you looking at, do you see those things as they're going to solve a lot of problems for you, or are they going to create a whole bunch of headaches that you'd rather not?
I think probably both of those things, but I'm in the camp that's very excited about them. So these are loads and storage resources that are flexible in space and time. So there's all kinds of things that can be done with these. In terms of customers asking about vehicle-to-grid capabilities, we're not hearing from residential customers about this just yet, and it's probably because most of the EVs on the market right now don't provide bidirectional chargers. But many of us have probably seen that Ford Motor's been advertising on TV for the last 2 years that their F-150 Lightning pickup truck has vehicle-to-home backup power capabilities, and they do provide that bidirectional charger to enable that. I think that's going to become standard in the future, and I think we're expecting that and planning for it as well.
Okay, very good, very good. And Chris, I just wanted to circle back to something. You raised the whole issue of energy efficiency. And no one on this panel, I think, is going to disagree. I mean, please go ahead if you do, but everyone has always thought that energy efficiency is a great idea. You ask any utility, ask any pundit, they'll always tell you, the electricity that you don't use is the cheapest, right? It's always seemed to me, though, that in this country, we often deprioritize it. We talk about it as if it's a good thing, but we never really invest or spend the proper time to do it. Am I wrong in thinking that? Are we doing enough on the energy efficiency front so that we don't need to build this gargantuan grid that's 2 or 3 times the size that is today? And how much opportunity is there to...
I think your conclusion is fair, but let me talk about branding. I think energy efficiency is the worst term ever. We in Indigenous Clean Energy use the term healthy energy living. And we say what we need is energy that contributes to our health. So for example, Indigenous housing is in terrible states across the country. One of the main reasons is that energy systems don't allow for that to be resilient. So therefore, with Indigenous Clean Energy, we've launched a major initiative called the Bring It Home Project Accelerator, so that we can retrofit every home in an Indigenous community to be up to grade, and every new build at standard. But the reason you do it is why. Why do you do it? You do it for safety. You do it for affordability, you do it for health. And those give you other attributes of benefit that are externalities now that we don't consider in the internalities of making decisions about electricity and power and energy. And so therefore, I think the reason why we haven't moved as fast as we are, and I do agree with your premise that we're not doing enough about it, and I think it's irrational there too. I mean, utilities, in fact, if they were given the right incentives to move in energy efficiency, they would do much more. And that was, in fact, removed by some governments in the last 2 or 3 years. I hope it comes back. But I do find that there are other benefits when you take energy efficiency. And if you look at it as healthy energy living, the consumer gets much more advantages that they value in different ways. And that makes energy more holistic in terms of lifestyle and industry.
Chris, you work a lot with Indigenous communities, and you mentioned some of the issues that Indigenous communities face on grid resilience. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that. Like, does it look the same for in Indigenous communities as it does in the rest of Canada? What are some of the more specific issues that Indigenous communities relate to?
I would say yes, plus. Certainly, Indigenous communities share the need for reliable and safe energy. But there's two other things that they also want. To me, there is economic resilience and there's ecological resilience that goes along with the reliability of power. The economic resilience is saying that I am a part of that future. If I'm also generating power, if I'm also benefiting because I can be a prosumer of energy, if I can benefit by selling power into the grid, then Indigenous communities are saying that's more the path of reconciliation they're seeking. So we are designing a new form of electricity. We are going to, it's not business as usual, so what does that future look like? So the things that Indigenous communities want is reliability, but they also want economic resilience. The ecological resilience is let's do it the right way. One, for climate, but two, let's make sure we don't make mistakes by doing something with the grid reliance that also harms ecosystems, harms wildlife, harms fishery. So Indigenous communities saying, Indigenous reliance of the grid, absolutely, but let's do more because there's more value to be gained if we economically participate with that resilience and ecologically we do it the right way.
Mm-hmm. In the past, I've written about First Nations water systems, and it's well known that in this country, water systems on First Nations territory, particularly, are often pretty ramshackle. But what do we see on the electricity side? I think we've discussed previously that there's an incredible diversity there, right? There's hundreds of communities, and some of them are right next to cities and well integrated with those grids. Some of them are remote. But what can be said about the state of grids on, for example, on First Nations reserves or other Indigenous communities, northern communities, for example?
Well, northern remote communities are going to be quite different, but I will say this. Here's the metric that I always like sharing. So Indigenous communities and organizations are the second largest asset holder of electricity assets apart from utilities. They own or co-own or have a defined financial benefit agreement with 20% of Canada's electricity generating infrastructure, virtually all renewable. As a result, they have a direct interest in making sure that serves their needs. So I wouldn't say that the reliability in the grid with Indigenous communities is dramatically different, with the exception of some communities that are at the end of transmission lines, and there are unique issues with the northern communities that are diesel reliant. But Indigenous communities now are saying they actually are the largest single group of players apart from utilities in this business. So they are totally wedded to an electrification future that is climate resilient.
They're also very involved in as proponents of some projects like the Oneida battery storage project. Ontario is very interested in the ISO, for example, seems very interested in battery storage, and adding some of this to the grid, experimenting with it, learning a bit about it, so that. And I was wondering, maybe Umesh, maybe you can help explain how that technology can improve the resilience of the grid. And
yeah, I mean, look, I think, battery storage. So we do have storage today in our grid, right?
Yes.
In Niagara Falls, for example, we have storage in our grid. So
some of it's been quite old, right?
Exactly.
Some of this stuff dates back a century, like pump storage technologies and whatnot.
But so battery storage will add to that. It acts as a buffer to get us through situations, whether it's climate related or weather related, whatever it is. Any type of disruption, the batteries will help us buffer that. And also, peak demand. We talked about peak demand earlier a little bit. That's another way to get through those peak demand situations where we don't need to put in more generation. We don't have to build more generation. So I think batteries are going to be a big part of building this resilient grid for the future.
Mm-hmm. And the Oneida storage project is so cool because my friends Matt Jameson with Six Nations Development Corporation and Annette Verschuren of Enerstor are the partners with that. The third partner is Tesla, but Elon Musk's not my friend right now. I'm not sure about that one. But so here's IESO saying we're going to bring an Indigenous community, a private company, a technology firm to help manage that technology, and they're going to do more of that. Right on.
Mm-hmm. And how does this look from a utilities perspective, Gisela? how hard is this stuff to integrate into the grid? What are the benefits once it's in place for battery storage?
I think we look for the upside in the proliferation of DERs happening at the distribution level, but it's certainly the case that the grid was not designed for this. It was designed for kind of top-down power flows, centralized generation, long transmission lines, et cetera. So it's been a process it's a challenge for utilities to do their planning work, and you know, it underscores the imperative for us to be adopting advanced technologies in our grid modernization efforts that are going to allow us more visibility and controllability with DERs that are going to allow us to restore power more quickly and to really unlock all the potentials of these devices that are down in the distribution level now with that new complexity.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Very good. In terms of new technologies, I was just reading the other day about that one thing that a lot of utilities have installed over the last decade is something called a FLISR, or a FLISR.
Yeah.
And this is a technology that is used, as I understand it, to pinpoint better, like if you have an outage, it really helps to know where exactly it is, as opposed to saying, well, it's along this line that's about 100 kilometers, let's have someone walk it and find the problem, you know, if you can pinpoint it. Can you tell us a bit about how that technology works? And
Sure. And it goes further than that. So
yes, I'm sure it does.
FLISR, as far as I remember, it's fault location, isolation, and restoration, as far as the acronym goes. And so the first part of it is that location, so quick identification or location of where the fault is, then isolating the fault, and then restoring service by finding an alternate to get electricity through. This really comes down to, you know, obviously having that redundancy, having the application of AI to identify alternate routes, as well as having the digitization with the sensing capabilities within your transmission and distribution system. And you know, if you have all of that, you've made the investments, then you can implement this type of technology that will quickly identify the fault, isolate it, and restore service to the downstream.
Mm-hmm. In my darker moments, I spent some time looking through annual reports from utilities, and I've seen them going back 10 years ago, maybe, that people were starting to install the. In fact, I'm sure it predates that. But how far are we along in installing that kind of technology in Canada? Are there areas of the country that just don't have it? That are still living in the dark ages, so to speak?
You know what? I'll start. I mean, I know it's out there in terms of the extent of it. Maybe Danielle, you might be better.
Any visibility on that?
No, I actually don't. I don't know if I can see the extent of that on our indices. That's for sure.
Yeah. No worries.
Now, I'll tell you one thing, right? Canada is a leader in developing some of this technology. Mm-hmm. In fact, you know. Quebec is an area where there's I think at least one or two companies that have just focused on this whole space.
Mm-hmm. What are their names?
All right, so one of them would be Eaton.
Okay. Yeah.
Eaton is actually in this business of fault location, identification, isolation, and restoration.
And you're a competitor?
And just to be clear, although our product development is done here in Canada, that is something that we're offering globally, and I think that we're more successful outside of Canada than we are in Canada with those offerings.
Okay.
So it tells you that we may be lagging in Canada, some of the other countries.
Fair enough. All right, so I think we're getting on to the 10-minute mark here, and I wanted to open this up to people in the room and see questions. Yes, you would.
So I've heard you say prosumer. I'm wondering what the role of industry is in leading the constituent prosumer energy literacy, and maybe, you know, being a proponent of transcending the political swings that affect the policies that underscore the infrastructure investment.
Well, I'll have a shot at that. I think it's a great question. And there are companies doing some fantastic things. If you look at McCain, for example, which makes the stat they make, their plants around the world make 60% of the French fries in the world. crazy number that is. But they've gone and said, okay, we're going to make every one of our plants net zero. And so they've done that in a number of places in Canada and the United States, and they will do all their plans shortly. And what they've done is they've actually developed renewable energy supply and storage, often, in fact, in Canada with Indigenous communities, which is great. And that's very strong. You look at the George Gordon First Nation in Saskatchewan, who's supplying solar power directly behind the meter to Nutrien as a major company, and Nutrien says, we'll buy that from you. So we're starting to see these different kinds of market relationships that are directly within industry and also with suppliers, including some being Indigenous proponents and partners, and also industry working with utilities. I mean, Loblaws makes $20 to $25 million a year, similar to the example that Gisela gave in terms of the consumer giving over their heat control and cooling control. Loblaws does that as well. So if it gets to a peak load, they'll turn on the chillers in Loblaws stores by 1 degree, 2 degrees for 4 hours, which won't affect the food quality at all, and that helps them manage peak load. That helps Loblaws, that helps the grid. So I think industry is going to have to be a key part of this, and leading companies are doing that.
Energy literacy is a huge issue, absolutely. And it kind of relates back to one of the earlier conversations as well about the politicization of electricity rates. The degree to which people understand, what the value is versus what the cost is. We might be able to avoid some of those political challenges because, frankly, the politicization of electricity rates, and we've seen it happen, in some jurisdictions at certain points of time. In the greater scheme of things, we were actually talking about very small numbers. If right now you look at what are the really big impacts on the pocketbook of Canadians, and I was at an event earlier this week that was talking about this. With the rise in interest rates for the average consumer who's going to be renewing in the coming months, we're talking about hundreds or up to $1,000 a month. Whereas the kind of increases that we're talking in electricity rates are probably going to be in the order of $20 to $30 to a customer. So the importance of actually having a clear understanding of these broader energy issues is important. But your critical question, though, is who is responsible for ensuring that we have a level of energy literacy sufficient so that we can have proper conversations and discussions, and that's partly your role, Matt.
Yes, I feel the weight on my shoulders already. Do we have any other questions from the floor?
Yeah, we have tons
From the audience.
Virtual audience.
Okay.
Where to start? There's a question about the workforce that we'll need to accomplish the energy transition, so skills training programs and workforce development planning.
Umesh, you started by, I believe, talking about this, right?
Yeah.
Somebody did. I think it was you.
I'll jump in. I can start it off. Look, I think that it's been identified as an issue that we are going to have a labor shortage, and this is one industry where we're going to have to do a lot in terms of not only attracting the labor, but also upskilling them and maybe reskilling them. If we're going to implement AI or digitization, it's a completely different skill set than what we've had for the last 100 years in terms of maintaining and running the grids. And I think, if we're talking about shortages, in addition to labor shortages, I think we're going to have to be very aware of possibilities of shortages. You mentioned it, Francis, around equipment, transformers, and things like that. Remember, we are not the only country in the world that's trying to go down this path. Right? Everybody's trying to go down this path. So I think it's important that we try to build as much self-sufficiency as possible here in Canada, whether it's with regard to labor and skill sets, and also in terms of equipment.
Yeah, and there's some real advantages to building things closer to home, right? To shorten those supply chains. I know there's a lot of talk about friend-shoring and near-shoring, but the reality is, if we're building the equipment and we're buying the equipment that we need closer to shore, we don't have to worry about a ship getting caught sideways in the Suez Canal.
That's true.
Actually, bringing things to a crushing. But you make a good point about we're not an island. This is international. We're competing, but we're also competing internationally for people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I hear that from my members when talking about where are we going to get the next generation of power line technicians. Well, we're looking internationally. We're looking at countries that have similar systems to ours and saying, maybe we should be recruiting from, that country. But guess what? There's 25 other countries that are also saying, maybe we should be recruiting from
Right.
there. So,
Yeah.
the challenge is huge.
Well, I think we are, one more question.
Sure, okay. I've been told to use this, sorry, I won't sing. Okay, the other question is, how are we developing customer relationships to participate in the energy transformation?
Can I add that I'm sure that just we'll have things there too. Earlier this week, I was in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, which had that terrible rail tragedy about a decade ago. And I went there because they have developed a renewable energy microgrid connected to the grid in Lac-Mégantic with some incredible innovative technologies. But the heart of that was the community working on it together, and a large part of that enterprise being owned by the community. It became part of their healing journey, part of their reconciliation story, and I was just incredibly touched to see how that community and the passion they have for the system that's theirs, that's helped them recover from something that was terrible.
I would just say that from Hydro One's perspective, it's a priority for us to be a trusted advisor to our customers. And so we're interested in helping customers become more energy resilient. And in some of those ways that we help them is we provide resources on our website around preparing an emergency preparedness kit, for example. We suggest that customers can take advantage of the federal Greener Homes program to weatherproof their house well, to retain indoor temperatures if there is an outage, and to do an energy audit, find out how they can be more energy efficient. But I would certainly encourage anybody watching to engage with their utilities, make your needs known so that we can plan for those in the future. Fill in our surveys, participate in our programs. We want to be there to assist you on this journey.
Very good. Well, unfortunately, I think we're out of time now. I would like to say a big thanks to Giselle, Daniela, Chris, and Umesh for being here today, and you, Francis. So thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. And I'd like to thank everyone also in our live audience and also online. Thanks for joining us. On behalf of the Golden Mail, I'd like to thank Eaton Canada for making this possible. And just a reminder that we'll be sending out a link of the recorded event in about 2 weeks' time. And thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.